17 seconds. That's all the time it took for my world to fracture. In the heavy gothic fog of the Valthor Syndicate's back alleys, Damaris Klyros stood like a shadow carved from stone, his sharp black suit a contrast to the filth surrounding me. His finger was leveled at my chest, a gesture of absolute execution. Behind him, the four enforcers were statues of silent, disciplined malice, their eyes reflecting the flicker of dying lanterns. Between my arms, Dracos Elion, the curse they wanted dead, trembled against me. He was a small, shivering weight of fur and stardust, his golden shroud pulsing with a light that shouldn't exist in a place this dark. His piercing blue eyes were wide, and I could see his tiny, frantic heartbeat thrumming in the hollow of his throat. They called him cursed. They called me expendable. They were wrong about both of us. Before my banishment, before the sky split open to reveal the judging hand of Xaverian Thal, there was just the rain. I remember the cold water hitting the cobblestones, the smell of ozone and rot, and the 17 seconds I spent staring into that gutter. I was a maid, a girl whose only value was the silence with which I cleaned up their messes. But when I looked at the dying pup, I didn't see a monster. I saw a heartbeat that refused to stop. And in that moment, I stopped being a servant and became a shield. I lived as furniture in other people's houses, an invisible fixture in the fog-lit service corridors of the Valthor estate. My world was one of cold cobblestones and the silent, heavy labor of the discarded. But my father, before the syndicate took him, left me a different kind of inheritance. The unshakable belief that the weak are never truly powerless, only undefended. The rain was a freezing curtain when I found him. In a narrow alley, tucked between the rot of the city and the arrogance of the elite, lay a bundle wrapped in tattered gold cloth. It was Dracos. He was barely breathing, a tiny heartbeat struggling against the encroaching dark. When I reached for him, he opened his eyes, piercing, unnatural blue depths that felt ancient, as if they had seen the birth of the stars. Most would have walked past. Most would have seen a curse. I saw a life that refused to yield. That night, in the cramped silence of my cellar room, I fought for him. I had nothing but my numb hands, my father's hidden medical notes, and a stubborn refusal to accept the mathematics of his survival. As I worked to pull him back from the brink, I knew my life was changing forever. You're watching Bound to the Alpha, and if you want to see how a lowly maid defies a mafia empire for a dying prince, stay with me until the very last heartbeat of this story. You won't want to miss the moment the sky finally answers my plea. The council chamber smelled of damp wool and old, stagnant power. At the center stood Damaris Klyros, his presence a cold vacuum that seemed to suck the warmth from the air. He didn't look at me. He looked at the golden bundle in my arms with the clinical disgust one might reserve for a gutter rat. When he stepped forward to examine Dracos, his movements were sharp, lethal. He leaned in, searching for a scent, a spark, a signature of the bloodline. Finding nothing but the unnatural silence of the pup's aura, he stood tall and declared the boy spiritless, an abomination under the old laws. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I spoke with the quiet, surgical precision of a woman who had spent her life watching these people from the shadows of their own hallways. I named every lie they were using to mask their fear. I looked into the eyes of the men whose wounds I had stitched and the women whose fevers I had broken. Not one of them met my gaze. The silence of the district was a physical weight, a collective betrayal that tasted like ash. As Damaris leveled his finger to finalize my expulsion, I tightened my grip on Dracos. I looked him dead in the eye and made my vow. If you want this pup, you will have to take him from my arms. And I promise you, the cost of this night will follow every person in this room for the rest of their lives. I walked out into the fog, unyielding, leaving them with the rot of their own cowardice. The weight of the exile didn't hit me when the gates slammed shut, nor when the first frost began to bite at my ankles. It hit me in the silence of the first night. I found shelter in a forgotten basement on the city's edge, a place I only remembered from the half-blurred geography of my childhood errands. The walls were weeping with damp, and there was no heat but the shallow, rhythmic warmth of Dracos asleep against my chest. In the flickering light of a single tallow candle, I took inventory of my life. It was a short, brutal list. My father's medical notes, a rusted utility knife, and 3 days of meager rations. Finally, I turned my attention to the golden cloth that had shielded the pup. As I spread it out by the firelight, my fingers caught on a heavy texture in the inner lining. Stitched in shimmering, defiant thread was a symbol I had never seen in the Syndicate's cold records. A sunburst pierced by a silver spear. It was a mark of high lineage, a sigil from a world that predated Damaris and his suits. I filed it under the mounting list of problems for a future version of myself to solve. I looked down at Dracos, his tiny chest rising and falling in perfect trust. "We're going to be fine," I whispered into the dark. The words were a lie, a thin paper shield against the encroaching fog, but in that basement, they were the only prayer I had left. The weeks spent in the city's forgotten underbelly felt less like an exile and more like an awakening. I moved through the drainage markets and basement sick wards, the jagged networks where the Syndicate's discarded were left to rot. I treated whoever needed treating, using my father's methods to stitch together bodies that the world above had deemed broken. Word travels fast among the unwanted. It is a currency more precise than any gold, and soon, the shadows began to speak my name. That was how I found Davari. A former enforcer with a voice like gravel that had decided to be useful. He bore a jagged scar from temple to jaw, the price he'd paid for having a conscience. He found me in a makeshift clinic, his presence looming but not threatening. "I hear you're the one who helps," he said, his eyes scanning the organized chaos I'd built. Together, we transformed that damp basement into a sanctuary. We secured clean water, organized food distribution, and created a functioning medical space out of nothing. In the center of it all was Dracos. He wasn't just surviving. He was thriving, crawling through the clinic and charming the broken men and women with those ancient blue eyes. He had a habit of grabbing everything within reach, inspecting bandages and vials like he was conducting the world's most important research. One evening, on a floor of cracked tile, he let go of a rusted table leg. He stood, arms wide and face incandescent with concentration, and took his first shaky steps toward me. In that moment, I realized I wasn't just building a clinic, I was raising a king. I returned to my father's notes late that night, the pages yellowed and smelling of dried lavender and old secrets. I was searching for anything that could explain Dracos's scentless condition, and buried in a chapter on ancient lineages, I found it. It wasn't a curse or a lack of spirit. It was a rare, dormant trait found only in bloodlines of extreme alpha potency. In these pups, the scent gland is suppressed by concentrated royal hormones, staying silent until the wolf's true power fully activates. My hands began to tremble. This wasn't a defect, it was a marker of extraordinary power. I called Davari over and spread the golden crest cloth across the wooden table. I watched as every trace of color drained from his scarred face. He didn't just recognize the symbol. He looked at it with the terror of a man seeing a ghost. "That is the Valthor sunburst," he whispered, his gravelly voice cracking. Hyperion Valthor's own bloodline. The world rearranged itself in that single sentence. The pup I had pulled from a rain-soaked alley, the one I had stitched back together in a cellar, was the heir to the most powerful sovereign line in the territory. The weight of the discovery was suffocating. If Dracos was a Valthor, he hadn't been lost. He had been discarded. Someone from inside that royal line had intentionally left him to die in the mud. I looked at the sleeping boy, realizing that my exile hadn't been an accident. It was a witness being silenced. He arrived at the settlement when the fog was at its thickest, a tall, controlled man wearing the dusty, nondescript robes of a traveling archivist. He moved with a heavy academic stillness, but his posture was all wrong. There was a military precision beneath his clothing that no scholar ever possessed. When I stepped close to treat a minor graze on his arm, his hands gave him away. They were calloused from the grip of a heavy blade, not the turning of parchment. As I leaned in, his scent detonated something in my wolf that predated thought. It was a smell like ozone and ancient cedar, a royal frequency that made my blood hum. Dracos, who usually studied strangers from the safety of my shadow, didn't hesitate. He crossed the room with a toddler's clumsy determination, climbed straight into the stranger's lap, and pressed his small nose against the man's chest. I watched, breathless, as the stranger's hand trembled visibly before settling on the pup's back in a gesture of instinctive, agonizing recognition. That night, after the settlement fell quiet, I placed the golden crest cloth on the table between us. The candlelight flickered over the sunburst and the spear. "I know what that sigil means," I said, my voice steady despite the hammering of my heart. "I need you to explain how the Valthor heir ended up half-dead in a rain-soaked alley." The archivist's disguise didn't just fall, it dissolved. What remained wasn't the cold face of a sovereign, but the shattered face of a father. Xaverian Thal, the visible sovereign, the king's chosen voice, sat across from me and stripped away the last of the world's illusions. The story he told was one of calculated rot. Dracos hadn't been born dead. He had been stolen. Theron Kaldris, the chief strategist and the man now manufacturing the city's chaos, had drugged the infant to mimic a corpse, removing the heir before the succession could be secured. Xaverian's voice broke as he spoke. "I was destroyed," he whispered, his godlike composure fracturing. "I let the men around me think for me because I could no longer think for myself. I didn't offer him the comfort of a lie. I mapped the enemy in 3 cold sentences and handed him the skeletal outline of a plan. He returned to the Citadel to play the role of the mourning loyalist, while I entered through the servants' gate, invisible as I had always been. Assigned to the basement medical ward, I became a ghost in the machine. I healed, and more importantly, I listened. I found Marin, Kaldris's personal archivist, suffering from a chronic joint pain that every court physician had deemed beneath their notice. Trust was built over 3 sessions of focused care and 1 strategically unlocked cabinet. When I finally saw the document I had been hunting for, the air in the room turned to ice. It used the word non-survival to describe the fate of a scentless pup. I copied it by hand, every word, every signature, until the ink felt like a bloodied oath on my skin. The Summit Council was a sea of cold faces and sharp suits, a room built to intimidate anyone who didn't hold a title. Xaverian presented the evidence with a voice like gathering thunder, and for the first time, I saw Theron Kaldris's composure begin to fracture. That was my signal. I stepped forward from the gallery, no longer the invisible shadow who scrubbed these floors, but the woman who had survived them. I placed my father's medical notes directly beside the disposal order on the central dais. The silence that followed was absolute. I didn't whisper. I spoke with a clarity that cut through the room's pretension. I explained the scentless condition, the dormant royal trait, and proved the heir's legitimacy. Then I looked at the council and named their sin. Every person who signed this order or looked away while a child was left to die is complicit in the assassination of the Valthor bloodline. The hall erupted. Kaldris bolted for the side exit, but he didn't get far. Commander Davari and my former exiles, positioned at every door, moved on my signal. 2 sets of iron grip hands stopped the strategist in his tracks. In the chaos, I caught Xaverian's gaze across the chamber. He wasn't looking at me as just the healer who saved his son. He was looking at the strategist who had dismantled his greatest enemy using nothing but a dead man's journals and a borrowed cabinet key. I wasn't just a maid anymore. I was the architect of their justice. Dracos arrived at the Citadel not as a captive, but as a king. He was carried by Davari, flanked by my former exiles, men and women who looked ready to cheerfully remove the head of anyone who breathed wrong near the boy. In the center of the Great Hall, Xaverian didn't just greet his son, he knelt. It wasn't a rehearsed ceremony, but an involuntary collapse of a father finally finding his soul. Dracos studied him with those ancient blue eyes, silent and knowing. Then he spoke his very first word. Mine. It wasn't a question. It was a declaration that shook the foundations of the hall. Xaverian's breath broke, a jagged sob of relief. But Dracos wasn't finished. He turned, found me standing 10 feet away, and held out his other hand. Both. He was choosing both of us. He had always been choosing both. In that moment, the mate bond sealed between Xaverian and me with the force of a supernova. The hall thundered with the roar of a restored bloodline. I sent nothing to the district that had expelled me, not a word of vengeance, not a single look of spite. My silence was the message. Under a starred sky, Xaverian and I finally marked each other. Teeth and breath and the gravity of two wolves who chose each other with eyes wide open. Dracos slept in the next room, the bridge between our worlds. His was the tiny, stubborn heartbeat that refused to stop, and in refusing saved us all. Thank you for staying until the very last heartbeat of this journey. If this story moved you, please show some love and support to Bound to the Alpha. Like, share, and follow the channel for more stories where the discarded finally get their crowns. I'll meet you in the next story.